All right, today's lesson is 15.3, finding trig values using a calculator. You will need either a scientific or graphing calculator that would have your sine, cosine, and tangent functions to be able to do this lesson and your homework today. All right, so first thing you'll want to make sure that your calculator is in degree mode. So put your calculator in degree mode. All right, some of you will see, if you have a scientific calculator, you'll see DEG on kind of like the bottom of your screen that you look at. If it doesn't say DEG, it might say RAD or something else, then you'll need to change it. Anyone have a scientific calculator in here right now? Okay. If you have a graphing calculator and you have never changed this, the default is always radians. So you will have to change it. On a graphing calculator, you'll have a button that says mode. All right, so if you click mode, you'll see, you'll see like the third row down, it says radian and degree. So you'll want to make sure it's flashing over degree. So you'll do an arrow over, press enter, and just quit out of that screen, and then it should be in degrees. All right, if you ever reset your calculator's memory, like if you have to take an ACT test where they wipe the memory on your calculator, it will always go back to radians. A lot of times the problems on the ACT are in degrees, so you might want to go back and change that after it's been reset. All right, so some of you have already done the ACT and whatever, oh well now, but just so you know. Okay, so today, your examples will say, find the function values with a calculator. All right, so if you are given cosine of negative 240 degrees, you could have been given a problem like that yesterday, because this would actually use one of our common angles. All right, but all I'm going to do, I'm going to type cosine, and then I type negative 240, and I press enter. And as long as I'm in degrees, I will get the correct answer. So you should get negative 1/2, because this would be one that would have a reference angle of 60 degrees, which would fall on our little chart or our special right triangles. All right, typically our ones aren't going to be nice like that because we have a strategy for doing that by hand and not with a calculator. So you may have problems that come out a little bit messier, which my next example was not messy. So let's do one that is messy. So tangent of 605 degrees. All right, make sure you check Math Excel for how many decimal places you need to go out to. Sometimes it'll be excessive and it might say 6, 8. Is it 8? Okay, that's what I was trying to remember, because the book wanted 8 decimal places. So make sure you do follow those directions. This assignment should be quick. You're just typing it in. There's no work really to do, but make sure you count out those 8 spots. How exciting. So 1, 4, 4, 5, 0, so I'm at 5 spots, 6, 9, I need one more, 2, and then after that is a 1, so I wouldn't need to round up or anything like that. All right, so it wants an excessive amount of spots after that. Okay, shouldn't be extremely difficult. If you're not getting these things, maybe your calculator, you didn't properly put it in radians at this time, or in, sorry, degrees. We will talk about radians next week if you're like, what is that? we will cover what that is. So stay tuned. All right, so if I ask you for sine, cosine, or tangent, not very difficult. You type it in your calculator. But if I ask you for something like secant of 97.977 degrees, do we have a secant button on our calculator? No. All right, so we have to use a little bit of knowledge to be able to use our calculator. All right, we know that secant is equal to a certain trig function's reciprocal. All right, so secant would be the reciprocal of cosine. So that means 1 over cosine of 97.977 degrees. Those would be equal, and I could type that into my calculator. And it should work for you to type that in all at once, because it's only doing one function there in your denominator. So we'll type that in. So I had negative 7.02059. I stopped there because I had never made my students go out to 8 decimal places when I made these notes. What's beyond that? 213. Okay, so that's kind of as difficult as it's going to get, is if you're given a secant, cosecant, or cotangent, then you would do 1 over that particular trig function's reciprocal function. Okay? It is not the same as an inverse. An inverse function we will talk about in a moment. All right, but good question. Students mix that up a lot. They'll call inverse and reciprocal, and they'll interchange those words, and I'll correct them, and they'll get mad and be like, same thing. No, it's really not the same thing. All right, so we'll talk about that actually next. All right. So if I have to find angle measures using a calculator. All right, so if you're given something like, it may also have directions that would say find theta in the interval 0 to 90 degrees. All right, so it's just saying that there's only going to be one angle there. If it asks for further than that, it makes it more complicated. We don't get into that in here. In the trig elective, we'll make it more complicated. Okay, so if you have sine of theta is approximately 0.9677. All right, so there you're given the ratio, you want to find the angle. The only time we've worked with this so far would be we'd have to figure out what quadrant that is, use the reference angle to figure out, or we'd have like 1/2 square root of 3 over 2, square root of 2 over 2. We're given all those ones that we're supposed to be familiar with as ratios. This is just a messy decimal. All right, so we need to approximate what that would be with a calculator. So it's like I'm solving for theta. Just like if I was solving an equation, you got to undo what's being done to theta. So I need to undo sine. All right, so I need to use the inverse operation. So I need to use inverse sine. So inverse sine on your calculator is the sine to the -1 button, which for most of you should just be like your second function that's written above sine and above cosine and above tangent would be those inverse functions. All right, so what I'm basically doing is when I take sine inverse of sine of theta, sine inverse cancels out sine because they're inverses, just like multiplication would cancel out division and so forth. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking sine inverse of both sides. If you think of it as like balancing out an equation and undoing those things, but all you're typing into your calculator then would be sine inverse, to use that second button for sine, and then type in your 0.9677. And remember, we're finding theta, so this would be my angle in degrees. So that would be 75 point, I only went out to 4 places because that's what I used to make students do. It might still say 8 in Math Excel. Very exciting. So I had 3979. I'm not sure if I rounded that last one. 1568. Was that it? Okay. And that's in degrees. Okay. So inverse sine undoes sine. Your reciprocal would be 1 over that trig function. So those are the difference between those two. Okay. We'll look at one more example here, and that's really going to be it. So as difficult as it's going to get for using like an inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent would be if I give you a trig function that we don't have on our calculator. So if I say secant of theta is approximately 1.0546, let's find that angle. All right, there is no secant button or secant inverse button, so I can't just type that in. So I have to use something I know about secant and use its reciprocal. Okay, if you think back to, an angle that we should be familiar with, cosine of 60 is 1/2. Okay, so its reciprocal secant of 60 would be 2. Okay, I just flip over that fraction. All right, so I don't know what this angle is. That's what I got to figure out. But I can't rewrite it as, I mean, you can write this as 1 over cosine of theta. But I don't know theta, so I have to work with what I've got. All right, so that's my ratio. But instead of it written as 1/2 that I could flip over to 2 over 1, I'm going to rewrite this as 1 over 1.0546. And now that's equal to cosine of theta. So I need to flip the ratio over. A lot of students struggle with that idea because typically the ratios we're given are written in a nice fraction form, but these are going to be a mess because these are not using our common nice angles of 60 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees. It comes out to be a mess with just about everything else. Okay? So when I go to do this problem, I'm doing cosine inverse of 1 over 1.0546. So a lot of students will do the reciprocal at the wrong time and then get these ones wrong. So do your reciprocal before the inverse for this one, okay? And then you'll be fine. So approximately, 18.5175 is where I stopped. 7834. Ooh, gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so a little annoying with those 8 numbers there, but you're just doing everything on your calculators. Okay, We'll need these for tomorrow. We're doing some application problems with right triangle trig, so we'll need to be able to use cosine inverse, sine inverse, tangent inverse, and finding the angles of just any angles in particular. All right, so go ahead and work on your homework.